So anyway, I was saying that PID is an old think tank and has had many luminaries, including, I think, who was here in the old days? Emile Dupre, for example, Irving Brecher, Harry Johnson, so many good people here. And we are trying to build this back to an old glory and make it a think tank that's, useful for Pakistani policy. So with that introduction, let me begin. Welcome Joe Studwell. Joe Strudwell is a visiting research fellow at the Overseas Development Institute in London, a very famous institute, an old think tank that does some very important, very interesting work. Can you take it? Okay. He's the author of 3 very important books. The most well understood and well read of them, I think, and Joe can correct me on that, is How Asia Works. I mean, it's a big bestseller. It's created debates. It's created a lot of interaction in the world. And it does summarize very well what we very loosely use in Pakistan, called the China model. We all think that somehow we know the China model, but I must confess, Joe knows it the best, and we must hear from him what the China model is. But I shouldn't say it's a China model. It's a broader book. It's a book about how Asia has grown and developed. It's a very important book because it argues that there are certain key factors which has allowed Asia, the Asian tigers, to take off. Even Bill Gates described this as one of his favorite texts on economic development, saying that this does a better job than anything else I've read of articulating the key role of agriculture in development. Joe, I should just to complete it, Joe has a PhD from the University of Cambridge Judge School of Business. Joe, my daughter's going there this fall, so I'll ask her to get in touch with you. His thesis was From Learning to Earning: The Transition from Manufacturing Catch Up to Competitiveness to the Global Business Frontier, as pursued in China's energy equipment sector. Joe, as I can now, more important, now Joe has extended his study to take what he has learned from Asia to look at Africa. So I think he's trying to complete his study of development and give us the broad factors of what helps make development policy. So it's a very germane and a very appropriate time for us to do that, Joe. As soon as I'm finished with you, I'm going to be listening to the budget speech of our the first budget speech of our finance minister, who's just taken over. So your talk, I'll tell him later. He actually told me he wanted to listen to the talk, but he's too busy with his speech right now, so you'll excuse him. But he promised to listen to your talk on YouTube, and I will communicate to you what his views were. But lots of people have told me and called me and said that they're going to send questions on the talk. So over to you, Joe. Make give us your ideas, and we'll have a brief discussion afterwards. Thank you, folks. Go ahead, Joe.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the introduction. And do raise your hand, anybody, if I'm not clear or my voice is not clear at any point. What I'm going to do is just to recap the key issues that are raised in How Asia Works, and then move on and talk a little bit about the work that I've been doing in Africa, in order to consider whether there are universal rules about what works in economic development, or whether everything is context specific. So to go back to East Asia, How Asia Works, that book sets out 3 things really, which it argues were fundamental to the remarkable success of the Northeast Asian countries of Japan and Korea, China, Taiwan, and now Vietnam. The first of those is very closely supported household agriculture off the back of land reform programs. It really sets the most successful countries in Northeast Asia apart from most other developing countries everywhere in the world. The fact that they had comprehensive land reform programs which were instituted and fully supported by government and led to very big yield increases. Not only to big yield increases, but to patterns of consumption in East Asia, whereby farm families or rural families more generally started to consume basic consumer goods and also construction materials which could be produced locally in these countries. And so therefore there was a connection between rural and agricultural takeoff and the priming of those countries for industrial development as well. I think this is a very important connection. We tend to separate agricultural development from manufacturing and industrial development. And you can understand why we do it, because it is it's a useful heuristic in academic terms, but in the real world, because people connect with each other, in fact, what goes on in the rural sector connects to other parts of the economy. And in East Asia, it was this demand that was created for basic consumer goods from the rural sector, which connected very, very powerfully into domestic manufacturing activity. So, number one, a big emphasis on household agriculture, small scale but high yield, demonstrating the rule that if you've got large amounts of very cheap labor available to you, that you can turn agriculture into a form of glorified gardening. And if you use vertical trellising, if you use very time-consuming things like applying water to plants individually rather than sort of spraying plants, that you can, so long as your labor is cheap enough, actually get higher yields from smaller amounts of land than you can by running large farms with large-scale equipment. This is something that people generally find very difficult to get their heads around, because we tend to think that agriculture is going to be the same as industry and there are going to be returns to scale. In reality, if labor is very cheap, there are not returns to scale. It's actually the inverse in agriculture, so long as you get the right extension support, the right credit support, and so forth as well. So the approach to household agriculture was a critical differential in East Asia. And then off the back of that, this over-focus, if you like, on manufacturing. And the way I often highlight that is, if you look, for instance, at the current experience of India in manufacturing, where India has never had a particularly strong manufacturing policy, about 15% of the workforce is occupied in manufacturing. If you look at the East Asian countries, if you look at China today, or you look back at Japan in the 1970s, or Korea or Taiwan in the 1980s, a peak of about 30% of the labor force was working in manufacturing. And there was a massive effort to overemphasize the role of manufacturing. Now, why would you do this? Well, one thing I've already mentioned is that if you've already got your agricultural sector moving on the basis of household small-scale agriculture, you're creating demand for stuff that you can produce locally. This might be glass, it might be cement, other construction materials, or very basic consumer goods like bicycles and so forth as well. But as Danny Roderick at Harvard has probably shown better than anybody else, manufacturing is the sector that provides an automatic skills escalator, if you like, taking people out of the rural economy and into the modern economy. And just as was the case in the 18th and 19th centuries, during the original industrial revolution, when people used to send children to work in factories, so it's the case today that you can put people of pretty low skill levels into factories and they will learn on the job. services isn't usually the case. Most service occupations or value-added service occupations are ones where you have to acquire a skill in order to be able to do a job. So you can't put people, for instance, into a call center who don't speak the language that they're going to need to use fluently and expect them to learn to operate in a call center on the job. But in manufacturing, when you go in at the bottom end, and that inevitably means garments and textiles, people do learn a lot of things on the job. And so manufacturing played a powerful upgrading role for human capital in East Asia. I think the third thing which really set the East Asian countries apart was what was done in the financial sector, which was pretty much the opposite of what the World Bank and the IMF were recommending at the time. The World Bank and the IMF have subsequently changed their tune, but if we go back to the sort of 1980s, 90s, then orthodoxy said that you absolutely should open your capital account, and the banking sector should be privately controlled. In East Asia, what happened was that capital controls were maintained until very late in the process. In other words, countries trapped their domestic capital within the country and didn't allow it to go off looking for better returns offshore. Banking systems were then used. It didn't seem to matter, or it didn't matter, whether they were publicly owned or privately owned. Ways were found to control and discipline banking systems to deliver credit to the chosen targets of these governments. And those targets, as I say, were manufacturing and household agriculture. So this was the recipe that was put together. It wasn't, I would say, particularly East Asian, in as much as many of the policies had originally been developed in Europe and were just further refined in East Asia. So we'd seen land reform policies in Europe during European development. We'd seen the Germans in particular use export-oriented manufacturing to develop very quickly in the late 19th century. So, and in fact, there were many connections with Europe, particularly through Japan, which sent many of its government research people and even ministers to Europe to look at the way that European industry operated. So it wasn't uniquely East Asian what went on, but it was the most refined version of these policies that the world has seen. So now we just move on and have a look at Africa. And can any of these policies be replicated in African countries? Well, first of all, I think that we have to, first of all, ask, is the context in Africa fundamentally different? And the answer is yes. One reason why the context in Africa is different to what we've had in Asia is the demographics. The demographic story historically in Africa is completely different to what we've seen in Asia. Africa historically has been the most underpopulated part of the world, or the most underpopulated significant part of the world. Africa in 1950, when it was getting towards the end of the colonial period, had a population which was less than that in Asia in 1500. Now, Africa and Asia landmass are about the same. So it just gives you a sense that Africa, in terms of population density, was 500 years behind Asia. The reasons for this are fairly straightforward. Africa had a disease burden quite unlike anything seen in Asia. whether malaria, whether sleeping sickness carried by the tsetse fly, whether more recent introductions such as rinderpest transmitted through animals. And on top of disease burden, Africa also had the most difficult fauna with which human beings tried to coexist. One of the big problems historically in Africa was trying to farm in the presence of African elephants. And in fact, when European colonial powers took over the continent in the late 19th century, what they found themselves spending a lot of time doing was culling elephants. Just in Tanganyika, what's Tanzania today, in the 1920s, for instance, the British were killing 800 African elephants every year. And elephants were reckoned to destroy between a quarter and a third of all crops in the country. So disease burden, fauna issues, other things has meant that historically Africa has been a very sparsely populated part of the world, and this has enormous implications for development. If you do not have a sufficient population density, then the unit economics of things like infrastructure just don't work. I mean, if you have, as many parts of Africa did still in the 1950s, if you have 3, 4, 5 people per square kilometre, how are you going to pay for roads? How are you going to pay for anything? The economics just don't work until you get up to a certain population density. As a side to this, it's I think an interesting point that the world is continually obsessed with problems of what it perceives as overpopulation. But if you actually look back at the history of economic development, you'll find that economic development doesn't happen until you hit certain minimum population densities. The world actually needs a lot of people, in other words, in order to develop. So demographics have set Africa apart. There just haven't been enough people until recently. In fact, Africa will, in about 2030, on current projections, finally have the population density that Asia had in 1960. So it's only now that Africa is getting into the game in demographic terms. Other things that set Africa apart, well, this is a part of the world where, in the takeover by European colonists, 10,000 polities were compressed into 40 colonies in a short period of time. Now, in the run-up to independence, mostly in the 1960s, most of these countries had less than a decade of national political activity going on before they became independent. And unsurprisingly, in the wake of independence, there were, in many of these countries, political conflicts, which were often violent. The other thing which set Africa apart in the post-independence era was having much the lowest levels of education among the African population. If you compare, for instance, with South Asia, only Mauritius and South Africa and Lesotho had a larger share of had a lower share of non-educated people, of wholly uneducated people in 1960. So if you think of a continent with 54 countries, only 3 countries within that continent had a better, higher level of human capital in terms of that basic education measure than India and Pakistan and Sri Lanka in 1960. And so this really saw Africa standing aside as a uniquely as a uniquely difficult developmental proposition. And it's really taken the last 50 years for African countries just to get basic levels of primary education up to a point where they already were in places like Taiwan and Korea in 1960. So this is to say that when we look at Africa, yes, we are absolutely dealing with something different. We're dealing with something, the demographic story is very different. The governance experience and the institutional quality are very different, and the educational capability very, very different. Nonetheless, we do have a small number of African countries that have been successful in their development efforts since the 1960s. And it's interesting when we look at them, what we see, I think, does not contradict what we saw in East Asia in terms of what is important. The first of the countries to have success was Botswana. Now, you probably know that Botswana is essentially a series of diamond mines in economic terms. What happened in Botswana is that those diamond mines were developed in an extremely effective manner. The deals that were negotiated with De Beers in South Africa for mining rights were very effectively negotiated, and the political powers within Botswana managed to avoid fighting over these remarkable riches that were discovered. So I think the first major point to make about Botswana, which we'll also see in other cases, is that one of the reasons why Botswana succeeded was because it managed to get a political developmental coalition. The different so-called tribes in Botswana are fairly closely related, but nonetheless they are distinct. And prior to and after independence, the leaders of the country managed to get the leaders of the different tribal groups to agree on a developmental coalition, which involved, for instance, everybody agreeing that whether minerals were found on one tribe's land or on another, that the returns would be that they would belong to the nation as a whole. Now, this wasn't a particularly easy thing to achieve, but it was done. And once a developmental coalition was formed, that was what took the country forward. Botswana and De Beers developed the most profitable diamond mines in the world. In terms of comparing with East Asia, however, what is interesting is that the one thing that the Botswanan leaders could not bring themselves to do was to change their agriculture policy. Now, agriculture in Botswana is essentially cattle because it's a semi-arid environment, and there's very little arable activity, but there's quite a lot of cattle ownership, and cattle can graze across large areas of the country, which won't support arable crops. However, traditionally from colonial times, the cattle farming was dominated by tribal aristocrats or leaders of the different groups, and post-independence they were unable to do anything to change this. The means of control from colonial times onwards was always who controlled boreholes to produce water, because as in many places in Africa, in theory, land is communally owned. But in reality, the ownership of land comes down to who's got the water. Because if you've got a water and 500 cattle around your borehole, they will just graze everything for miles and miles and miles. Nothing was done post independence to confront the aristocratic control of very large herds of cattle in Botswana and their dominance of the agricultural sector. And in fact, it continued to become more extreme to a point where a vast proportion of the rural population today lives on welfare transfers. So there was no replication of support for family farming in Botswana. And the other thing that didn't happen was there was no delivery of a manufacturing sector. There was periodic concern about unemployment. There were various schemes that were run offering subsidies if people would start manufacturing based on the number of people that they employed. But on that basis, people would be employed in factories which would simply close down when the subsidy programs ended. So there was no real manufacturing sector that had any kind of global competitiveness in the style of what we saw in East Asia. And the result of this was quite interesting, that despite Botswana having one of the 2-3 highest rankings for governance among all African countries, despite the development of the diamond mines extremely effectively, despite doing everything that the World Bank in particular asked in terms of spending money on education, on health, and on basic infrastructure. Despite all of this, the failure to confront the situation in agriculture and the failure to develop any kind of manufacturing sector left this country going from extreme poverty to a GDP per capita of $15,000 per person, but still left it with a Gini coefficient of inequality of about 0.6, and as one of the 5 most unequal societies in the world. And so I think that the lesson there is that if you're a resource-rich country, then yes, you can develop by managing those resources well. But if you want any kind of social equity in your country, then the lessons of East Asia remain valid. That it is an equitable approach to agriculture and to manufacturing that are going to give opportunities to a broader group of people within your society. The second major success story that we've seen in Africa, and again a low population country, is Mauritius, which is an interesting little island about 800 kilometers east of Madagascar. Historically a French colony, well, originally Dutch, then French, taken over by the British because it was being used by pirates to attack British shipping. But the British left the French farming population, which were relatively large-scale producers of cane sugar, in place. It's just a monocrop island with cane sugar on it. The British ended slavery in the 1830s and then replaced the slave population with indentured labor from India. And when it came to the 1960s and the move towards independence, it was quite an interesting situation, because as the political system liberalized, which began actually in the late 19th century, you had, and I'm using sort of India in a pre-47 sense here, you had an Indian majority population and an economically dominant Franco-Mauritian sugar growing elite. And so there was quite a lot of tension around independence. There was a very strange electoral situation where the Franco-Mauritians actually allied with what are called the Creole population, the descendants of the former slaves, against the Indian population, and were opposed to independence because they thought it would be Indian hegemony in the event of independence. But what happened was, like in Botswana, the critical first move towards developmental success was a developmental coalition. And it was actually Ramgoolam, the first Indian premier, who really reached out to the leaders of the other side and created a unity government, which came together, committed to tackling the chronic unemployment problem that was the biggest social problem in Mauritius. Unlike Botswana, though, what happened in Mauritius was that government really did confront both the agriculture sector and the need for manufacturing development. The agriculture sector was confronted by increasing levels of taxation on Mauritian sugar exports, and the money was deployed, and also fiscal incentives were created to push the so-called sugar barons into manufacturing activity. Initially, there was some industrial substitution, import substitution industrialization efforts just at the beginning, just really giving these sugar barons businesses that they could run with very high levels of protection, just to get them used to doing something other than sugar. And then there was a switch to export-oriented industrialization, focused on garments, and subsequent later on vertical integration into textile production. The potential to get into manufacturing was heavily driven by access to European Union markets through the ACP allowances for African and Caribbean and Pacific ex-colonial nations to sell into Europe. But that possibility was there for a lot of African countries. The difference was that Mauritius was the one that took advantage of it. And it was remarkable in the 1980s that when the population was about 700,000 people in Mauritius, the country created almost 100,000 jobs in garments. At that point, it was in 10 years. So Mauritian unemployment went from over 20% to 3% in not much more than a decade. But the other point was that the manufacturing sector that was created in Mauritius also created jobs for low-skilled people who'd been working on the sugar estates to come out of that activity and into something else. So once again, a very broad-based set of opportunities. And where I was saying that Botswana, which didn't address the agriculture sector, didn't make any serious effort to develop a manufacturing sector, ended up with a Gini coefficient of inequality around 0.6. Mauritius ended up at about 0.37. So absolute night and day between the two things. And Mauritius really was the first country in Africa to follow something like an East Asian prescription for economic development. Well, the final one to mention, I think, and one I'm afraid we'll all be conscious of because it's been in the news for all the wrong reasons in the last couple of years, was Ethiopia. And Ethiopia, of course, was the country that appeared to be the first large population country in Africa to be following that East Asian recipe. And brought brought out of the period of the Derg Maoist government in 1991 by a remarkable individual, Meles Zenawi, who is probably the best informed developmental leader that I've ever come across. It's a curiosity of Ethiopians involved in his government that so many of the political leaders somehow found time on the side to write master's theses or PhD theses, almost always related to the work that they're actually doing in development in Ethiopia. I got hold of a copy of Meles's master's thesis, and just looking at the bibliography is quite extraordinary how well read he was in terms of particularly East Asia, particularly the East Asian development model. And anyway, Meles came to power in Ethiopia in 1991, when the country had a GDP per capita of less than $100, and then going forward from there, Ethiopia grew at 10% a year for more than 2 decades, and it did so off a thoroughly East Asian approach. The first part of that approach was very, very aggressive support for household farming through extension, through the availability of credit, through new marketing support. And then the second part, which began in the 2010s, was the beginnings of the development of a dozen export processing zones, which were aiming to bring European and Chinese and Turkish and Indian and other investment into Ethiopia for processing that was being displaced by rising wage levels in these other places. So, for instance, when I first went to Ethiopia, I was talking with Chinese investors who were telling me, well, you know, we're here now, labor costs $60 a month. That's what it used to cost in the mid-1990s in China, but now in China it costs 600. And so, yeah, this is where we are going to grow. And I think to an awful lot of people, Ethiopia looked like it was going to be, as I say, the first large population African state that was going to deliver on accelerated economic growth. Unfortunately, as we know, over the past 2 years, this has fallen apart in an ethnic conflict between the Tigrayans, who dominated Tigray for nearly 30 years after Meles came to power. Meles was himself, half Tigrayan. And Abiy, who the current premier, who is Oromo. And yes, it's been an unpleasant reminder of the fact that ethnic challenges are always threatening to get in the way of economic development in Africa. Nonetheless, what I would say about Ethiopia is that in terms of everything that we've seen that has been so positive and which had a huge impact in reducing poverty rates in the country, everything that we saw in Ethiopia that worked suggested that what worked in East Asia is also applicable in African countries. And I think that Mauritius showed us that, and I think that Botswana showed us that in terms of showing us what you get in the absence of a focus on smallholder agriculture and the absence of manufacturing and the extreme inequality that has been associated with Botswana's development. So those are the three stories where there's been some success in Africa, and I think that they tell us that smallholder agriculture and manufacturing are not just something to do with East Asia, that these are things that are universally important. The last thing I would say really is something about the prospects for Africa from where we're at the moment, and say something about the prospects on the one hand in terms of agriculture, and on the other in terms of manufacturing. In terms of agriculture, we see a lot in the press about the increase in imports, agricultural imports into Africa, and it's correct that agricultural imports have been increasing. However, I think really the biggest story is that since 2000, so now for over 20 years, agricultural GDP in Africa, across sub-Saharan Africa, has been growing by an average of about 4.5% a year. So that is well ahead of the rate of population increase, which is now about 2.7, 2.8%. And I think that's very positive, and it's under-recognized how Africa is making progress in agriculture. More problematic, I would say, is that what the growth in the agriculture sector in Africa represents is individual action by farmers and investors. It doesn't tend to reflect effective action by states. And so another thing that we see, which is a big trend in Africa, is that the average size of farms is actually, the output attributable by farm size is actually increasing. So it's now medium-sized farms, for instance, in a place like Zambia, that account for half of output. Because what is happening is that you're getting demographic growth. Finally, in Africa, you're getting more and more big towns, more and more big cities. And if you think of, for instance, Nigeria as an example, in 1950, there were only 3 cities over 100,000 people, and now there are 80. That's just in 70 years. And those cities are creating demand for agricultural production, but more and more of the production is being met not by original farmers, but by city people who are investing in farmland. And government isn't moderating or controlling this. So it looks like the direction of travel is in a direction which is going to lead to more and more scaled up farms, not huge farms, but 20 to 100 hectare farms, using some agricultural employment, but people who are employed on a very tenuous basis, and at the same time, a system that is going to create a large rural population without employment. So the good news is we're seeing long-term increases in agricultural output. The bad news is that it is being done in such a way that underemployment and unemployment in rural areas is going to increase at a rapid rate. And then the second point to consider or to mention is manufacturing. And I think the manufacturing story in Africa is the really worrisome one. When you go and see the bits of manufacturing that exist, for instance, garments in Lesotho or garments in Madagascar, there's no problem with African workers. There's no problem with the companies which say, no, people are dexterous and they're getting what they want. However, there's only a handful of examples of concentrated manufacturing sectors in Africa. And to me, there's a dangerous willingness on the part of many political leaders in the country to think that, oh, Africa can be different. We don't have to have manufacturing. We'll just jump straight to a pure services-based economy. I don't think that is a realistic idea. No one can ever explain to me what all these people in services are going to do in the absence of any manufacturing activity. And instead, it points, I think, towards chronic, very high levels of unemployment in African economies that will be very dangerous. And they'll be domestically dangerous, but they will also be dangerous to Europe, because when you get massive numbers of underemployed and unemployed people on the African continent, then the numbers seeking to migrate to Europe increase as well. On top of which, you know, we've all seen in recent years the rise of terrorist groups, in particularly in the Sahel in Africa. And, you know, this is again very much connected to an absence of agricultural and manufacturing opportunity for people. So, but I don't want to sound completely despairing, because I don't think it's too late. What I think needs to happen is for politicians in Africa to recognize that manufacturing is going to need to be a part of Africa's future, and indeed has already been a part of success in Mauritius and then in Ethiopia until the recent Ethiopian war. And it's going to have to be something that is pursued more generally on the continent. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Joe. That was very good, very elusive. Please, folks, whoever wants to ask questions or comment can raise their hands. Meanwhile, I'll just raise a point. Joe, in a sense, if I read you right, and I've read your book, How Asia Works, and your talk just now was very good too. What you're arguing for, I see a lot of similarities between what you're arguing for in early development economics. Am I wrong? In the sense that you are advocating also that we should maybe even ask for a land reform and get to small landholder kind of cultivation. And we can also think of the landholder cultivation eventually creating a surplus to move to manufacturing, and that will eventually lead to more density of population in the cities and modernity. And if you go back to the earlier development economics, for example, Harris Todaro and I forget now, various people, including I forget the famous Nobel Prize winner, that the idea was that somehow the surplus labor will deliver agriculture productivity, which will lead to urban development and manufacturing development. And you make that case convincingly that, yeah, this is the way to go. I have a couple of thoughts on that. In Pakistan, which we tried this thing, because we were one of the first countries to be made independent, as you might recall. India and Pakistan were the first sort of colonies to gain independence. And India moved in its own direction. And we in Pakistan were the early laboratory for development economics. The Harvard economists came here, the USA economists came here, and everybody came here and advised us. And we took all the advice possible. We did almost all these things. And you also talk about financial repression as a way to develop. Yeah, financial repression should be, capital controls and financial repression and directed credit are important. But it worked in East Asia, I accept that, but certainly it didn't work in Pakistan. And in parts of Africa, it's been tried too, didn't work. So how do you, would you sort of comment on this? That what are the factors now that might be possible that didn't work in Pakistan and worked out there?
Well, I think one thing I always think is that things only work in countries when they are the ideas of the people in those countries, and the conviction comes from the people in those countries. I mean, I find it hard to think of examples where outsiders turned up in a country and told people what the best thing to do was. Well, they might tell people something that was theoretically a good idea, but they would have no idea whether it was actionable. And, you know, so if you look at East Asia, the history of those states was all about, you know, you had domestic constituencies of people who knew what they wanted to do, and they sought outside support for technical support and other things, you know, like the way that the Chinese would deal with the World Bank or the IMF. But not just China, I mean, Korea as well. So I think that if anything is going to be done, it needs, you know, things work when you have, you know, well-informed people within a country who've come to a conclusion that this is definitely what we should do. And so I don't think that I don't think that going around giving sort of must-do prescriptions is helpful. And I hope that's not what I would try to do. I mean, I think for me, what's interesting in Africa is to, you know, I mean, I came to Africa and I said, well, you know, is this going to be completely different? But as I say, when I look at a place like Mauritius, or I look at Ethiopia prior to this this recent fighting, then you know, recipes that used in East Asia are applicable once they are adjusted to the local circumstance. And again, that takes local people to do that. I mean, the Mauritian sugar industry is quite a good example, because the Indian-dominated Labour Party in Mauritius and in the 1950s was talking quite seriously about nationalising the sugar industry, and, you know, potentially doing a land reform there. But in the end, when they got into this developmental coalition with the sugar interests, they didn't give up on making the sugar sector work in the national interest, but they took a different approach. They went for a taxation of ad valorem taxation of sugar exports, and raised a lot of money that way. Yeah, I don't know if that's I don't know if that's a good answer, but I do think that it's always important that that development policy comes from within countries. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's helpful to try to dictate from outside what is inevitably going to be the best thing to do.
But then, while you're conducting these studies, this kind of begs the question, have you looked at the fact, something that we've been researching at PIDE, that there is a huge and growing industry. In Africa, it's huge. I mean, for example, Oxford and LSE and Paul Collier have babysat Africa for the last 40 years. There's a huge industry run by the multilateral donors as well as the bilateral donors that offer policy advice to these countries. And the countries that have less capacities tend to lap up that advice. And at the same time, the donors have a remarkable interest in seeking to sell their advice. So they have money to sell their advice. And for example, companies like Oxford Policy Management, Adam Smith International, you probably heard of them, that they, and International Growth Center, they receive hundreds of millions of dollars to advise these countries. At the same time, our officials work for those companies because they are hired by them on occasion. There's a huge incentive problem. I'm trying to build up the model. So does that impact on policy? And obviously, the local constituencies for policy or reform, I can tell you, I've worked in Africa, I've worked in Nigeria, I've worked in East Africa. They're all gone. They don't exist because the space has been taken over.
Yes.
Sorry, can you hear me? My internet just died. Can you hear me?
Yeah, no, I can hear you.
Okay, great. So in a sense, there is, I've done some papers on this too, that the local, what we call brain drain and what I call human capital flight, the migration of the talent that goes into Europe is replaced by the consultant that comes in from the West. And this exchange has been happening for the last 50 years. Does that have any impact, or is it the factors that you're talking about? The fact that all the policy advice comes from outside, and then there's this thing called best practice. In terms of best practice, we all have been told we must have a stock exchange. All of us have been told we have to have a mortgage market. All have been, although we are a very poor country, we have a mortgage market. We also have a mortgage, we have a Fannie Mae. And the Fannie Mae was imposed on us by the IFC. We have all the infrastructure that you have, regardless of our stage of development. We've also got a huge welfare program now. We have a huge fiscal deficit. We've got a welfare program that's going to give free medicine to everybody in the country, advised by donors. Your comments?
Well, yes, I mean, I think, you know, I'd go back to what I was saying. My observation when I lived in China was that, you know, China was never a taker of development advice that it wasn't interested in. You know, China knew what it was interested in, and I think that that's the place that you need to be in. I mean, I don't, you know, I wouldn't attack the IMF or the World Bank, you know, as for lacking expertise. I mean, they have fantastic people, but I think it's about, you know, I suppose very crudely, I'd sort of say, you know, there are two kinds of countries. There's a minority of countries where the people within them who are running those countries have worked out, you know, where they want to go and what they want to do in order to develop the country. And they're really just looking to test those ideas against outside people and get technical support. And then there are other, you know, you get another type of country, and there are too many of them, where people are just saying, you know, what do we do? And I think that's almost inevitably fatal for the reasons I said before. I mean, not least that it doesn't matter how smart people are, they'll never know a country, its political and social environment, like the people who were actually born there and live there. But I agree with you. I mean, you know, yes, there are. there's this whole development industry, and you get some very perverse incentives.
Joe, I've worked for IMF for 30 years. I've worked in many different countries, and I do remember when I went there on a 2-week mission and left a report there. I used to tell the friends that I made out there, that this report is for our bosses. Please don't take it seriously. I know how to write. I can write reports, but I can tell you in 2 weeks, it's very difficult to get to know your country. And that also sitting in a 5-star hotel and talking to your officials. So I think there again, I've got a huge information bias. So that's a fact. But the other thing is, I'm not trying to blame them. And yes, they're good people, but there's also a problem that if you want, if you say the primary factor is not land reform, or the primary factor is not agriculture, the primary factor is domestic policy capacity, then somehow, and also I know, as I said, I was in the IMF, I worked at the World Bank for a while too. Yeah, we keep talking about capacity building.
Mm.
And I remember arguing with many of my bosses, Mike Musa, for example, Stan Fisher, etc. I kept asking them, and I still ask, can I have a conference on capacity building? Can I please try and understand what capacity building is? Or is capacity building another name for Orientalism, that you feel that and that those guys need to be, I won't say the term, those guys need to be developed capacity. And as soon as we develop capacity, the guys shoot off like I shot off into the West. So we can never have a domestic policy-making capacity. And we get these prescriptions that you must have a mortgage refinance authority, you must have a stock exchange, you must have a competition commission, you must have a regulatory body of this, that, etc. We have more regulatory bodies than we have economists in the country. And all of them have been given to us by donors. We have 100 donors sitting in Islamabad. I was the Minister of Planning in this country, and I used to tell them, hey, I can't work. And I remember Kamal Darwish, when he was the minister in Turkey, he also put this out, that I spend so much time dealing with donors, I don't know when I can do my work. So that's a major factor too, I think. But let me come to another point. Acemoglu and Robinson wrote this famous paper on, I forget now, but I call it the log settler mortality. I'm sure you've seen it, on the impact of colonial rule and its kind of persistence over time. How does that fit in with the story that you're telling? Is that I see you didn't quite account for that. If Acemoglu's story is correct, then it was really just the state structure that the colonials left behind that kind of told the story on development. Is that a correct assessment?
Yes, I mean, a lot of what you see in Africa is path dependency, and the path that is being followed is often one, set by in the colonial era, even though the colonial era wasn't that long. I mean, I suppose the classic example from many African countries would be the manner in which, because colonial powers came in and decided that, well, the easiest way to run this is we'll decide that everybody's in a tribe, and then every tribe has got to have its land, and then we'll demarcate it. Because most land is controlled by customary law, what that has meant, and this has only been reinforced, for instance, in a place like Kenya since independence, it means that land disputes end up as ethnic disputes, because any sort of struggle over land has a tendency to turn into ethnic conflict. So yes, I mean, I think, and it's probably unsurprising that that's particularly the case in Africa, because although colonialism was short in terms of its duration, when you take 10,000 polities and you shove them into 40 colonies, and then you draw boundaries, and then you give them independence, and you say, right, guys, off you go. That's pretty traumatic. And I mean, the point is often made that, if Africa were like Europe, as population finally has started to grow, it would spend hundreds of years with people fighting each other over land, which hasn't really happened. What's happened, I mean, there have been very few interstate conflicts in Africa. What there's been is all this civil war between people who've been shoved together in states that they could never necessarily have expected to have been in. together. So yeah, there's all of that, and I suppose, you know, if we look further at the three, I mean, of the three success stories, or, you know, that I mentioned, I mean, Botswana is genuinely, I suppose, unusual, but then it's also genuinely unusual to find 3 diamond mines under your country, you know, with so much money in them that that's all you need to get everybody to $15,000 GDP per cap. Mauritius is unusual, you know. It's, as people have said, actually, like Seychelles, like Cabo Verde, you know, no one was there, and then everyone came from outside, so no one can really claim that the land, that they're the sons of the soil or whatever, which helps. And, you know, as I mentioned, Mauritius was one of only 3 places in 1960 in sub-Saharan Africa that had a better educational profile than South Asia. So it was a bit different, and Ethiopia, of course, is a bit different in the sense that it's the one place that was never colonized. So I suppose that, you know, having had some success in those countries, maybe it shouldn't surprise us.
Okay, let me go to the floor and get some questions. Shahid?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the thank you, Joe, for the nice talk. This is Shahid Mahmood, research fellow at PIDE. Just a few short questions. Dr. Nadeem just mentioned Asimoglu and Robinson. They wrote their book "Why Nations Fail." They used to have, I don't know if they still have their blog, but they used to have a blog on that book. And in one of those blogs, I read something very interesting. It was about Africa, and it reminded me of Afghanistan. You must have heard of the war economy and people there being like warlords who have their interests in the war continuing on rather than peace coming to the region, because that's their livelihood. That's how they make their money. And he also gave an example in that in many African countries, it's a same kind of situation persisted, that there were people, there were groups whose interest was more in wars and conflicts continuing on rather than peace prevailing. So would you agree with that? What would you say about that? And how does that hinder development prospects?
Yes, I mean, you know, vested interests are always there, and a war where the vested interest is in continuing to fight is an extreme example, but vested interests are present in any developmental situation. I think the one thing I say here is that, you know, that's why at the outset of a positive developmental experience, you're going to see, I think, some sort of political action which likely will either take the form of what happened in Botswana or Mauritius, which is the creation in a democratic setting of a developmental coalition where everybody agrees on a set of principles, and actually what we're going to be about is developing the country, which sounds easy, but it's obviously not easy at all. Or else development is going to begin with war itself, or revolution, which would be the case with what started in Ethiopia in 1991, which would be the case with Park Chung-hee's coup in 61 in Korea, which would be the case with the 49 liberation in China, or the arrival of Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan, or the victory of the communists in the north and then the south in Vietnam. So yeah, I suppose, you know, one way or another, a really significant developmental trajectory, I think, is going to begin with a major political moment.
Okay. Well, if there are no further questions, let me ask one more, if I can, Joe. Going back to another um, uh, paper or book by Acemoglu and Robinson, Why Nations Fail and North's famous social order argument. The colonial state was by nature set up to be an extractive state. Most of us have retained that extractive state, especially people like Pakistan, Asia, Africa. The East Asian state or the successful Asian state changed radically because of revolutions and various things. Does that have any bearing on the situation? The fact that we've got inherited an extractive state, and the fact that we kept it going, we've got the same state going, and we've got the same colonial civil service, and we've got the same institutions, judiciary, etc. And there's a Pakistani author from the 60s or maybe 50s, Hamza Alavi, who used to be a professor at, if I remember right, Birmingham or something. He wrote a famous paper, which was, well, in the New Left Review, so okay, fair enough. But he wrote a paper called The State in Post-Corrosion Societies. And he talked about, it's a little known, I mean, Pakistan is well known, but little known outside. And the state in post-colonial society is interesting because he talked about the state, which was overgrown and extractive and was different from the polity of the country. Polity was heavily underdeveloped. So he talked about it, that there is a possibility that there would be a deep tension between the post-colonial state, which was inherited and which now, as Acemoglu and Robinson say, is extractive, and the polity of the times, because these people who have been known, or these institutions who have been known to be contemptuous of politics, will not be able to let politics develop and let the kind of consensus that you talk about, that the consensus in Mauritius or wherever that was developed, or that was developed in China through a revolution. So how would you see the situation, or how would you see this argument? Is this correct? What weight would you give this argument?
Yeah, I don't know the paper. It sounds interesting. I mean, I think that I think there's something qualitatively different in African countries where indirect rule was used, and it really was an effort to operate these colonies at least possible cost. I mean, colonialism was never generous, but I mean, but I think there is a qualitative difference, and that's made it harder for African countries. But it's just one thing on top of a lot of things. You know, as I said, I mean, you know, it's interesting that, particularly in the 90s, at the sort of peak of Afro-pessimism, it was very common for people to point out that on World Bank numbers anyway, GDP per capita, that sub-Saharan Africa was wealthier than South Asia in 1960, and then that this has been reversed. But I personally think that was and is a misleading thing to point to. So even if the data are right, which actually show South Asia at something like 3 times, I think, the GDP. Sub-Saharan Africa at something like 3 times the GDP per capita in 1960. Even if the numbers are right, they don't tell you about the challenges of exactly what you were just sort of pointing to in terms of the political environment, the institutional environment, and then, as I said during the talk, the educational environment, where in 1960 there was one estimate that there were 8,000 people in the whole of sub-Saharan Africa with a secondary school education out of a population then of 220 million. So yeah, I think all of those things all of those things have been a huge challenge. And today, when you talk to people in Africa who are more optimistic, and I don't know if this is your experience, but it's certainly mine. If you talk to people who are more optimistic, they always seem to talk about generational change, and say, well, we've needed to wait to get a couple of generations away from where we were at in 1950, 1960. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Tell me the last question. How important is the role of financial repression in development? We tried that for many years. And also related to that, we also tried import substitution. And the problem now is that we are still stuck with import substitution industries, like, for example, the car industry, which we don't have a car industry. We have a car Lego industry. Those, what they call kits arrive. We assemble and we sell them to the domestic population at a huge cost, and we will never export automobiles. But all this was done with a repressed financial market capital controls, as well as selected credit, as well as tariff protection. And tariff protection seems to grow every year. The domestic consumers are punished every year. We've just increased the tariff protection to these companies. And it's all in the name of domestic import substitution and directed credit. So what is the way out of that? Is that because somehow these people in East Asia, as you pointed out, managed to keep this transitory, as theory would suggest. But in many places, these guys, just like in the smoking lobby in the US or the gun lobby in the US, the capital controls policy, and therefore we can never get rid of these two policies.
Yeah, I mean, ISI was always there in East Asia as well, but it was never, well, I suppose momentarily very early on, but the EOI was always dominant because governments governments took the need to be in a strong enough position in terms of foreign exchange reserves very, very seriously. And this is the risk that you get into with ISI if you have politically connected people who can get you to essentially maintain tariffs so that they profit from things that are doing nothing for the country. And I don't know. I mean, I don't claim to know anything at all about Pakistan, but I would. I don't really understand why the country shouldn't be able to develop export-oriented industry. I mean, you've got to push people into it because everyone would like to sort of have an easier life if they can have it. I don't think anybody wakes up in the morning thinking, oh, do you know what I'd really like to do is run a factory making pullovers for Marks and Spencer or whatever. I mean, because it's very hard work and it's very competitive, but it creates a lot of jobs for not much capital. It's like when I was looking at the garment sector in Madagascar, I mean, it's like and that really began with Mauritius when labor costs went up in the 1990s and they offshored some production to Madagascar. And Madagascar went into a political meltdown in 2002 that all the factories had to shut for 15 to 24 months. And there was another meltdown in 2009, and the Americans withdrew the AGOA accreditation. But despite all this, despite the government doing nothing for the textile sector and having, regular political crises, there are today about 250,000 people employed in the Madagascan garment sector. It's this stuff, and I mean the story in Bangladesh. You all know better than me, but I mean even this is in a sort of really half-failed kind of garmenting sector in Madagascar. There's still 250,000 people working. So that's why. That's why it's so important for countries with large amounts of unskilled and semi-skilled labor to take all this seriously.
Thank you very much, Joe. This has been wonderful indeed. We've learned a lot. Your book was very provocative. I remember reading it with interest, and I thought we'd get in touch with you. But the one thing that I think comes out very clearly, that it is our business to make a country grow, and that every country has to take ownership of their own policies. But somebody needs to do a book, Joe, and I hope you'll take it. Somebody needs to do this book on is the donor industry killing us softly with their love? I mean, is the fact that we are inundated with advice.
Yeah,
some of us not very good. I've told your High Commissioner here, please take your aid away. We don't need it. Your firms, Oxford Policy Management and ASI and various think tanks need it more than us, or LSE. My old school is LSE. I've worked with Paul Collier. I mean, these guys need it more than we need it. We don't need that advice. But then the problem is we've got a domestic issue. Our leaders or our civil servants who are trained in the British tradition, who grow up in that tradition, don't know the difference. They want to follow that because they feel that it's good advice. And that advice comes with no skin in the game. Every time there is a problem, the fault is ours. Every time there's some good thing happening, the credit goes to the donors. So there's a huge asymmetric asymmetric credit problem here, no skin in the game problem here that we should think about. But unfortunately, we keep copying the best practice. And we've got so much best practice that we've created 134 regulatory agencies with no markets. We've got 134 regulatory agencies. We haven't got a single market. By market, I mean a market that shares information, that clears prices, that allows mergers and acquisitions. We don't have a single market like that. But yet we have 134 regulatory agencies. We've got a welfare system that's now probably larger than Britain's welfare system. And our per capita income is like, I think, 1/20th of yours. So I think we have a deep problem. How do we address this problem? Our fiscal deficit goes up, and right now we're in the middle of negotiating our 23rd program. That means one program every 5 years. And I talk to the IMF people all the time, my former colleagues, and they say, hey guys, what can I do? And they're right. As I said, I work for the fund. With a 5-year horizon, I can only do fiscal arithmetic. I can't do any deep structural changes. And the IMF is not an agency that can do deep structural changes. So there we are. We are caught in the conundrum, and we are trying to solve our way from out of this. And just as you suggested, the reason we are doing all this in PID and what we are trying to do is form the domestic policy constituency for a good policy, for change and reform. I can tell you, we are probably 100 years away from it. So you're right about generations. This will probably take about 3 generations. But I think 3 generations of surviving like this, the population growth rate of 3%, is dubious. So keep the immigration doors open. We have a lot of people to send to you. Thank you very much. All the best. We'll be in touch with you on your next book, inshallah. All the best. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.